I thought I was hiding from the world. I had no idea the world had already been hiding something from me, buried beneath the floorboards of a stranger's cottage in a village so small it didn't appear on most maps, in a valley where the only sounds at night were the wind pressing against the window glass and the distant, indifferent murmur of a river I hadn't yet found. I told myself I was retreating, recovering, that a woman was allowed to disappear for a little while after everything she had trusted turned out to be architecture built around a lie. I was a surgeon on extended leave, a woman who had walked away from a marriage, a city, and a life that had been quietly dismantled around her while she was busy saving other people's lives. I thought I had already found the worst of it. I thought the worst had already happened. The diary I found wasn't a stranger's. The name written on the first page, pressed into the paper with an ink so deliberate, so precise, it looked less like handwriting and more like a legal declaration, was mine. My full name, Clara Whitmore. My maiden name. Written in a hand I recognized immediately, in a journal dated 4 years before Mark and I had ever spoken a single word to each other. That was the moment I understood I hadn't been loved into a marriage. I had been hunted into one, and the hunt had started long before I ever knew I was prey. Let me take you back to the beginning. Not my beginning. The beginning Eleanor chose for me. The one she had been constructing in careful, patient increments before I even knew she existed. 6 months before I found that diary in the valley, I was 38 years old, and by every external measure, my life was the kind that made strangers at dinner parties lean forward with a particular mixture of admiration and envy. I was a cardiothoracic surgeon at St. Ambrose Medical Center, one of only 4 women in the department and the only one who had made senior attending before 40. I had spent the better part of a decade building that career with a single-mindedness that left very little room for anything else. 12-hour shifts, weekend calls, research papers drafted at midnight on a kitchen table littered with cold coffee and surgical journals. My hands had been inside living hearts. I had held people's pulses in my palms and coaxed them back from the edge of silence. I was good at what I did. I knew it, and more importantly, my patients knew it. The apartment was on the 14th floor of a converted building in the city's West End, with tall south-facing windows that let the morning light pour in long and golden across the hardwood floors. I had refinished myself the first summer I moved in, on my hands and knees with a rented sander, calluses forming on palms, more accustomed to surgical gloves. I love those floors the way you love something you made with your own body. That apartment was mine, purchased 5 years before I met Mark, with a down payment that had taken me 3 years to save, working night shifts and eating most of my meals from the hospital cafeteria. It was modest by most standards, but mine in a way that nothing had ever been mine before, not since childhood, not since the years when everything that mattered could be packed into a single overnight bag. The mortgage was nearly paid. I thought about that sometimes, in good moments, standing at those south-facing windows with the city spread out below me, coffee cooling in my hand, and I felt something that was very close to peace. Mark arrived in my life at a medical conference in Boston. He was an orthopedic consultant, charming in the careful, measured way of a man who has learned exactly how much charm to apply and precisely when to pull it back. He was funny without trying too hard. He remembered small things, I said. The brand of tea I preferred, the name of a novel I'd mentioned offhand in a hallway conversation, and produced them weeks later as though he had been carrying them gently in a coat pocket, waiting for the right moment. I thought that was love. I thought the care he took with the small details of my life meant that he valued me. I understand now that it is exactly how a careful person builds a dossier. We married 18 months after we met, a courthouse ceremony and a dinner at a restaurant I loved, with a handful of friends and my father, who flew in from Portland and wept quietly through the entire meal in the way fathers do when they have been worried about a daughter for a very long time and are finally, cautiously, allowing themselves to stop. I wore a cream dress from a boutique around the corner from the hospital, The food was excellent, the wine was dark and warm, and I remember sitting across from Mark at that candlelit table and thinking, with the quiet certainty of someone who has waited long enough to recognize the real thing. I was right to wait. This is it. Eleanor arrived in my life 3 days after the wedding. I had met her once before. A Sunday lunch at a restaurant she chose, where she ordered for the table without asking, sent back the wine twice, and spent 40 minutes describing a renovation to her house in Westchester in a level of detail that made me wonder if she expected me to be tested on it afterward. She was a tall woman, angular in the way of someone who had been carefully thin for so long it had become structural, with silver blonde hair cut close to the jaw and a perfume that arrived in a room several seconds before she did. Something heavy, floral, and proprietary that clung to upholstery long after she left. She smiled at me that first day with a warmth that was technically present in all the right facial muscles, but managed, somehow, to bypass her eyes entirely. "Clara," she said, holding both my hands and studying my face with an expression I read at the time as maternal tenderness. "You work so hard. You must be exhausted all the time." It was meant to sound like sympathy. I recognize now it was the first question of the intake interview. After the wedding, Eleanor appeared with a frequency that felt initially like eagerness. A new mother-in-law anxious to be included, overcompensating with casseroles left on the doorstep and invitations to Sunday dinners that became standing arrangements before I had quite agreed to them. I was busy enough that her presence at the edges of my life barely registered as anything other than background noise. When Mark told me she would be joining us for the holidays, I nodded and moved on. When she began calling him every morning, a ritual I learned about not from Mark but from the charge nurse at work who saw me check my phone during a surgery debrief and said, "Everything okay? Your husband's called 4 times." I told myself that was their dynamic, formed long before I arrived, and it was not my business to disrupt it. When she started asking questions about the apartment, I answered honestly, "That is the part that still tightens something in my chest when I think about it." I answered every question with the straightforward transparency of a person who has never had cause to be strategic, who was raised to believe that candor is the foundation of trust. She asked what I'd paid for it, and I told her. She asked what the current mortgage balance was, and I told her, even pulling up the number on my phone to make sure I was accurate. She asked whether I'd had it appraised recently, and I said no, but that I'd thought about it. She smiled and said, "You really should. The market is extraordinary right now. You could do very well." I thought she was being helpful. The first moment I felt something I couldn't name and couldn't dismiss came on a Tuesday evening in March, nearly a year into the marriage. I had come home from a 14-hour shift, a triple bypass that had gone beautifully, followed by 2 hours of paperwork that had not, to find Eleanor sitting at my kitchen table with a cup of tea, going through a stack of mail. Not her mail, mine. The utility statements and insurance documents and a thick envelope from my mortgage lender that I hadn't yet opened. Its seal. I noticed this with the precision of someone trained to observe things that are slightly wrong, repressed with the careful deliberateness of someone who had opened it and needed it not to look that way. I stood in the doorway in my coat, bag still on my shoulder, and watched her for a moment before she noticed me. She was not reading quickly, the way you might skim something by accident. She was reading slowly, methodically, with the focused attention of a person who is looking for something specific and is not afraid of being caught because she has already prepared the explanation. "Eleanor," I said. My voice was steady. Behind my sternum, something went very cold. "What are you doing?" She looked up without a flicker of guilt. "Oh, Clara, there you are." She set the envelope down and smiled. "Mark let me in. He had to run to the pharmacy. I was just tidying up. You know how mail piles up." Mark had not told me he was going to the pharmacy. Mark had not told me she was coming. I looked at the envelope from the mortgage lender, and I knew with the quiet certainty of someone who has spent years reading evidence that it had been opened and resealed. I looked at Eleanor, who was watching me with an expression of such serene openness that the correct response Why are you reading my financial documents? Dissolved somewhere between my brain and my mouth before I could form it. That's my mail, I said instead. Of course it is, she said pleasantly. Would you like some tea? You look tired. I let it go. That is the weight I carry now, and set down only recently. I let it go. I made tea, I sat across from her, and I listened to her talk about the Westchester renovation for 20 minutes, while the opened envelope sat between us on the table like a stone neither of us acknowledged. When Mark came home and kissed me on the cheek and said, "Isn't it lovely Mum came by?" I smiled and said yes, it was very lovely, and I told myself I was being paranoid, that she was merely a woman from a different generation with different ideas about what belonging to a family meant. I told myself that for 8 more months. The questions continued. They were always casual, inserted into larger conversations with such smoothness that by the time I registered their sharpness, we had moved on and doubling back felt disproportionate, neurotic. At an April dinner party at her house, she asked very lightly whether I had ever considered investing in property outside the city. "Your apartment is wonderful," she said, refilling my wine glass without asking. "But it must be a great deal to maintain alone. Wouldn't it be simpler to liquidate and put the equity somewhere more flexible?" I said something non-committal and glanced at Mark. He was looking at his plate. He had been looking at his plate for most of the dinner. In June, standing in her garden after Sunday lunch with the sun on our faces and bees working through the lavender, she asked whether I had a will. She said it the way you say, "Have you tried the new place on 5th?" Casually, warmly, as though the question had just occurred to her and was no different from any other small domestic concern. "You're a surgeon," she said. "You understand better than most how quickly everything can change. You should have things in order." In August, the copy of my apartment deed that I kept in the study filing cabinet had been moved. Not taken. Moved. Filed under H instead of A. I mentioned it to Mark very carefully in the tone I use for things I am not yet ready to confront directly, and he frowned at the ceiling and said he might have been searching for the insurance documents. He might have mixed things up. His voice was so perfectly calibrated to normal that I let it go. Again. I was not being paranoid. The week everything fractured, I was on night rotation. 3 days on, 2 off, back on, the grinding cycle that leaves you existing in a permanent state of caffeinated half-sleep where the world's edges blur and you stop questioning things that should be questioned. I came home on a Thursday morning at 6 a.m., quietly, because Mark was sleeping. I set my bag by the door, peeled off my jacket, and walked toward the kitchen. The study door was open. The desk light was on. Mark was in the bedroom. I could hear the deep, even rhythm of his breathing from the hallway. I stood in the study doorway and looked at the desk. My mortgage statement, a copy of my apartment deed, the insurance policy I had taken out when I bought the place, arranged on the desk with the careful precision of documents prepared for presentation. Beside them, a yellow legal pad in Eleanor's large, confident handwriting, numbers I recognized as my mortgage balance and the apartment's current market estimate. A calculation I didn't immediately follow. 2 circled initials, RP, and a date 6 weeks away, underlined twice. And at the bottom of the page, in letters larger and more deliberate than everything above them, 3 words that rearrange the floor plan of everything I thought I was living inside. Transfer of title. I put the legal pad down exactly where I had found it, aligned to the corner of the desk. I walked to the kitchen. I started the coffee. I stood at the counter and watched the liquid darken in the carafe, and I thought, with the perfect clarity that comes only at the absolute outer edge of shock, that my marriage was a construction, that my apartment, the one I had built my adult life around, the one with the floors I had sanded on my own hands and knees, was the object of a plan that had been running longer than I had known Mark was alive, and that I needed to be very, very careful. What I did next is the part I am least proud of. I didn't call a lawyer that morning. I didn't confront Mark. I did what I had been doing for 8 months. I put it in a box, sealed it, placed it on a high shelf inside myself, and went to work. I operated on 3 patients that day. I saved 2 of them without question, and for the third, I sat in a family waiting room afterward and held a woman's hands while she cried, and I told her, honestly, that her husband had fought very hard. I was good at my job. I was less good, it turned out, at protecting myself. That night, I came home to an empty apartment. Mark had left a note on the kitchen counter. Gone to Mum's for dinner, didn't want to wake you, back late. And I sat at the kitchen table in my coat and read it 3 times and felt the box I had sealed that morning begin to strain against its lid. I opened my laptop. I typed the initials RP into the search bar alongside the name of our city and the words real estate attorney. The 4th result was a firm, Rourke and Partners, that specialized in what their website called title transfers and property restructuring. Their offices were 6 blocks from Eleanor's house. I closed the laptop. I poured a glass of water. I didn't drink. I went to bed and lay in the dark with my eyes open and my hands folded on my chest like a patient waiting for a procedure, listening to the city's distant sound and trying to build, from the pieces I had, the shape of what was being done to me. I did not sleep. By morning, I had the shape of it. And by the following week, after I walked into the office of Rourke and Partners on a Tuesday afternoon with my name and my deed number and asked very quietly whether any documents relating to my property had been submitted or reviewed, I had more than a shape. I had, in the paralegal's careful, horrified face and the supervisor she went to fetch, and the conversation that followed in a glass-walled conference room with a glass of water I also didn't drink, the confirmation that someone had filed a preliminary title transfer application for my apartment using a power of attorney document bearing what was purported to be my signature, a signature I had never written. That was the moment the box broke open. That was the moment I understood that Eleanor had not been a nuisance, had not been merely boundary crossing, had not been anything as simple or forgivable as a difficult mother-in-law. She had been executing a plan. And Mark who had looked at his plate, Mark who had led her into our apartment, who had been at the pharmacy, who had left that legal pad on the desk and gone to his mother's for dinner while I lay in the dark and tried to understand what I was losing, Mark had known. I drove home, packed 2 bags, sent the documents from my phone to my own lawyer, and left. I did not leave a note. I did not call. I drove for 4 hours south and then east, past the city's sprawl and into the lowland farmland, and then into the hills, until the road narrowed and the signal on my phone reduced itself to a single wavering bar, and I followed the directions I had found weeks earlier for a rental cottage in a village called Harwick that barely registered as a named place on any map I'd consulted. I needed to be somewhere I could think. Somewhere Eleanor's perfume could not reach me. Somewhere I could lay out everything I knew on a plain wooden table and look at it clearly and decide what came next. The cottage had been empty for years. The owner, a retired schoolteacher named Mrs. Paley, who lived in the village's only proper house and apologized twice for the state of the floors, had rented it for 2 weeks with a handshake and a cash payment and a look that suggested she had seen women arrive in this valley carrying that particular weight before and had learned not to ask. I was grateful for her discretion. I was grateful for the silence, and the cold, and the river I could hear, but not yet see, and the wooden table where I could spread out the photocopies of the forged documents and my own mortgage records, and think. It was on the 3rd day, when I was pulling a stuck drawer from the kitchen dresser to see if there was anything useful inside, that the cottage gave me something I had not expected. The drawer came loose with more force than I'd intended, and behind it, in the shallow cavity between the dresser's frame and the stone wall, something fell forward and landed on the kitchen floor with a soft, dry sound, like a hand placed gently on a table. A journal, cloth-covered dark green with a spine cracked along one edge from years of something pressing against it. I picked it up. It was heavier than it looked. I set it on the wooden table among my photocopies and my cold coffee and the afternoon light coming sideways through the small kitchen window, and I opened it to the first page, and there was my name, Clara Whitmore, written in the large, deliberate, unmistakable hand of a woman whose perfume I could still sometimes smell in the fabric of my own coat. Beneath my name, a date. 4 years before I had ever attended the Boston conference. 4 years before I had ever heard the name Mark Ellison spoken aloud. And beneath the date, a single sentence that made the kitchen tilt around me, made the floor feel suddenly unreliable beneath my feet, made me lower myself into the chair with the careful, deliberate slowness of someone whose body has understood something several seconds before the mind has caught up. She is the one, the surgeon. Everything we need is in her hands, and she doesn't know we exist yet. I read the first page 3 times, then I turned it over and read it again from the back, as though reversing the direction might change what the words meant, might rearrange them into something that made a different kind of sense. They did not rearrange. She is the one, the surgeon. Everything we need is in her hands, and she doesn't know we exist yet. I set the journal down on the table and pressed both palms flat against the wood and breathed. In through the nose, out through the mouth, the same rhythm I use before a difficult procedure when steadiness is not optional, when the shaking in your hands is a luxury you simply cannot afford. Then I picked it up again and read further. Eleanor kept records the way a general keeps maps. The journal was not a diary in any soft or personal sense. It was not a record of feelings or reflections or days. It was a ledger of intent, organized with the cold efficiency I had always, in a distant professional way, admired in her. She had dates, notes, and names. She had what appeared to be excerpts from a conversation with someone she referred to only as D, a man who seemed to have been providing her with information. There were references to my surgical department, to my hospital, to a profile of my career, assembled from publicly available sources, journal publications, a hospital web feature from 2 years before I met Mark, a conference program listing my name as a panelist. There were notes on my apartment building, the address, the building's sales history, an estimate of my equity, all of this in Eleanor's hand. All of this compiled before Mark had ever stood beside me at a conference reception and asked whether the Pinot Grigio was as bad as it looked. I turned pages. The early entries were reconnaissance, dry, functional, a series of observations and calculations that read like the preliminary notes for a business acquisition. Then, approximately 60 pages in, the tone changed. A single entry in a slightly different ink, as though written at a different sitting. M has made contact. She responded well. He says she is careful but not suspicious. Good. Careful people are easier. They trust their own judgment and don't ask the right questions until it is too late. I thought of every moment I had told myself I was being paranoid. Every time I had placed something alarming in a box, sealed it, and walked back into the life I thought was mine. Further in, there was a section on the mechanics of the plan. Numbered steps, timelines, the initials RP appearing alongside a note about standard title transfer procedure and a reference to a power of attorney template. The signature she had forged appeared to have been practiced. Near the back of the journal, my name was written in Eleanor's hand repeatedly, in rows, in the manner of someone learning to copy a signature, 15 times in descending increments of precision, until the final rows looked, at a glance, indistinguishable from the actual signature I had pressed into a dozen legal documents over a decade of adult life. I closed the journal. Outside the kitchen window, the light had shifted to early evening, the sky pale gold before the cold set in, and the river I could hear but not see was steady and entirely indifferent to everything happening inside the cottage walls. My coffee was cold. The photocopies of the forged documents were arranged to my left, and somewhere in the city, 4 hours north, a woman who had written my name as practice for a crime was waiting for the title transfer to complete. It was on page 47 that I found the second thing I had not expected, a name I didn't recognize, Simone Archer, with a date from 9 years ago and a single clip notation beneath it, lost. Property returned by court order. M was 24, too young, too visible, will not make the same error twice. I sat very still, then I opened my browser and searched the name. Simone Archer had been Mark's girlfriend at 24. There was a court filing from 9 years ago, publicly accessible with the right search terms, in which a property transfer had been successfully challenged and reversed on the grounds of fraudulent documentation. The respondent was listed as Eleanor Ellison. Eleanor had done this before. She had used her son to access a woman's property, failed, and spent 9 years refining the method. She had identified me, a surgeon, financially independent with significant equity, as the next attempt. And this time she had been patient, thorough, meticulous, and invisible until she wasn't. I put my phone down on the kitchen floor and looked at the ceiling for a long moment. Then I called my lawyer, Diane, who had handled my property purchase 5 years ago and whom I had never needed for anything more consequential until now. She picked up on the fourth ring. Clara. She had a way of saying my name that conveyed she was listening and that whatever I said had her full attention. Someone has filed a forged power of attorney against my apartment, I said. My voice was steadier than I expected. I have the documents, and I found a journal that documents the entire plan in the original author's handwriting, including what appear to be signature practice samples. A pause. Then, how quickly can we move? Diane moved quickly. She told me not to return to the apartment yet. She told me to photograph every page of the journal and send the images to her immediately. She told me that what I was describing was criminal fraud and that the law firm Rourke and Partners, once subpoenaed, would be compelled to produce every document submitted through their office. I spent the next hour on the floor of the cottage kitchen photographing every page with my phone torch, sending them in batches. My hands were steady. A surgeon's hands remember their training even when the rest of her is in pieces. Then I called Mark. He picked up on the second ring with a voice carefully calibrated to normal. The voice of someone who has been waiting for a call they knew was coming. Clara. I'm in Harwick, I said. I found Eleanor's journal. The silence lasted 12 seconds. Then, Clara, I can explain. I know about Simone Archer, I said. The second silence was different from the first. Where the first had been the silence of a man composing a defense, the second was the silence of a man watching the defense collapse. When he spoke, his voice was smaller, stripped of its careful calibration. How did you... It's in the journal, Mark. The timeline, the practice signatures, the meetings with the lawyer, everything. Diane has photographs of every page. I paused. When I spoke again, my voice was very quiet. How entirely without heat, like the surface of a winter lake. You introduced yourself to me because she told you to. The conference, the wine, the things you remembered, all of it was a script. It wasn't a question. No. His voice cracked on the word. Clara, no. What I felt, what I feel. That wasn't a script, I swear to you. But you knew about the apartment. You knew about the lawyer. The third silence answered before he did. I didn't think she would actually, he began, and I heard it then. The sentence every weak person says when they have allowed a terrible thing to move forward step by step because each step, individually, was small enough to excuse. I didn't think she would, actually. I had heard variations of it in hospital corridors, from families who had watched a small symptom go unaddressed, from patients who had ignored a warning sign for months because addressing it would have required a change they weren't willing to make. It was, in every version, the language of someone who had chosen comfort over action until the cost of action became unavoidable. You are going to meet me tomorrow morning at Diane's office, I said. You are going to bring every document you have relating to the title transfer, the power of attorney, or any communication with Rourke and Partners. You are going to give a full account. And then, I stopped, breathed once, slowly, and then we will see. He came. I will say that for him. He came. He walked into Diane's conference room looking like a man who had not slept, and he answered every question fully without evasion for 2.5 hours. He had known about the title transfer plan. He had not been its architect, though that distinction mattered less to me with each passing week. He had known, and he had stayed quiet, and he had carried the legal pad from his mother's house into our study and left it where I would find it. Not by accident, Diane established within the first 20 minutes, but deliberately. He had been trying in the cowardly way of someone who cannot confront his own complicity directly to leave me a clue. He had been hoping I would find it and save both of us so that he would never have to choose. I have turned that sentence over more than any other in the months since. I set it down now the way you set down a heavy object you have been carrying too long, not gently, but with the exhausted care of someone who knows they will need both hands for what comes next. Eleanor was served with papers on a Wednesday. Diane coordinated with the title registry, the law firm, and a detective named Frias, who had worked property fraud cases for 15 years, and told me, with professional flatness, that this was one of the cleaner cases of documented premeditation he had encountered. The forged POA was flagged and frozen before any transfer completed. The application was voided. Eleanor's account, delivered, according to Diane, with extraordinary composure and a great deal of talk about family misunderstandings, was directly contradicted by the journal, the signature practice pages, and the records from Rourke and partners. Diane also found Simone Archer. She responded within 48 hours. Yes, she remembered. Yes, she still had documentation. Yes, she was willing to speak with an investigator. Eleanor did not go quietly. She called Mark in escalating registers after the charges were filed. "You are destroying this family after everything I have sacrificed." She attempted to file a complaint with my hospital's administrative line. Reviewed, found baseless, filed. She appeared on the pavement outside Diane's office building one Thursday morning in her good coat and her arriving before her perfume, and stood there for 40 minutes before security asked her to leave. Each action was documented and added to the file. Diane had a phrase for this pattern, delivered in her entirely unalarmed voice. "She is building her own case for us, let her." The settlement Eleanor eventually accepted included a formal admission of fraudulent conduct, restitution of legal fees, and a restraining order covering my address, my workplace, and my father's address in Portland, because I did not want her anywhere near the man who had cried quietly at my wedding dinner because he had believed, for the first time in years, that I was safe. Mark and I did not reconcile. The divorce was finalized 4 months after the charges were filed. The apartment remained mine. It had always been mine and always would have been, but the point was not purely legal. The point was that something had been aimed at the center of the life I had built with my own body and my own years, and it had not reached its target. I had stopped it. Not through luck, not through accident, but through the accumulation of everything I had spent a decade building: precision, steadiness, the refusal to look away from evidence once it was in front of me. I went back to Harwick once, in the autumn. The valley had gone gold and rust, the hillsides burning with it, and the river I had heard but never found was there now. Narrow, fast, running shallow over limestone. Mrs. Paley was in her garden when I arrived. She looked up, recognized me, and gave the small, certain nod of a woman who had expected this return. I returned Eleanor's journal to the cottage. Diane had photographs stored in 3 locations. That was what mattered legally. The physical journal I placed back in the dresser drawer and pushed it shut. Let the cottage keep it. Some things belonged to the place where they surfaced. I sat on the front step with tea from Mrs. Paley's kitchen cupboard and looked at the valley in the afternoon light, and I felt, not happiness exactly, not the uncomplicated ease of someone for whom nothing difficult has happened, but presence. The specific, hard-won quality of a person who has moved through something painful with both hands, still steady. My father called. He called most Sundays now, a habit we had rebuilt carefully after years of comfortable distance. I picked up before the second ring. "How is it out there?" he asked. I looked at the valley, the light on the hills, the road between stone walls leading back toward the world. "Quiet," I said. "It's very quiet." "Good," he said. And then, after a pause in which I heard him settle into his chair, that familiar creak I had known since childhood, "Come home when you're ready." When I drove out of the valley an hour later, the signal returned bar by bar, and the city announced itself in distant signs and highway noise. I felt the weight of the last year settle differently, not lighter, but carried differently. the way a person carries a heavy thing not by setting it down, but by adjusting the angle, redistributing it across a stronger part of themselves. Some women are chosen as targets because they seem manageable, because they are careful and competent and trust their own judgment and don't ask the right questions until it is too late. Eleanor had written that as analysis. She had meant it as an advantage. She had not accounted for the possibility that a woman trained to read evidence, who has held living hearts in steady hands and coaxed them back from silence, might eventually turn that same precision on her own life and refuse, when the moment came, to look away. She had known everything about me before I knew she existed. In the end, I knew everything about her too. That is the only kind of fair that matters. Fair,